more collegiality, the faster and further we're going to go as a species.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to what you were just saying a few moments ago, that we only have a language for, and I'm going to put an umbrella term here, but we only have language for the extremes of experience. So what you were saying is when you're on a hike or a walk, you don't have a term for what that feels like because it's not an extreme of being asleep or being awake. It's kind of like this in-between cerebral state that we don't have a language for. And I think that on a micro level makes sense to all of us, where we have words like I'm angry or I'm sad or I'm upset, but our word for is okay, right? Like our word for okay is okay, which isn't a great descriptor of how we actually feel. And so we're only good at describing things in extremes on a micro level. And then if you zoom out and take that on a macro level, that translates as well, where we're only good at dealing with these extremes. And when you're saying Venn diagram, it's saying, well, get away from the extremes and look at the overlaps. But I think we as a society on a micro level and at a macro level have only learned how to deal with the pendulum swing on either side or the extremes on either side. And therefore, anything in the middle or the gray starts to feel uncomfortable, starts to feel it's not easy to say whether it's right or wrong. And therefore, it's like, well, we're not even going to go there. And I think anyone that I've spoken to at the top of their field, you being one of them, anyone we've ever had on the show, is far more interested in the gray, is far more in the gray, and is spending far more time exploring thought that is unclear, uncomfortable, and uncertain, because that's where life really is lived, in the unpredictable.
Yeah, that's the adventure.
That is the adventure. That is the adventure. And I feel that that's why humans want to go to space. Like, why is everyone fascinated by space? Because it's not clear as to what it is and what's out there and where it is. And of course, not many people will get to go to space, at least for now. But the idea being the same, that there has to be that curiosity from all of us to say, oh, where are we in the same place? Like, where are we connected on our idea? And where are there things that aren't similar, but maybe they're connected in a different way? And I think being able to oscillate between connectivity and disconnectedness is a need for the brain and the mind, as opposed to this feeling of, again, it goes back to what we started with. Safety and acceptance makes us feel today that you can't allow yourself to engage in an idea that doesn't fully connect with yours, because that feels unsafe.
Right, especially right now, right? Things feel very polarized.
Correct.
You know, I'm putting in a very strong vote for the League of Reasonable People, which is hopefully everybody, right? Like I don't want to sound overly sentimental, but like and maybe I'm just too emotional lately, but I am so pained by the amount of fighting that I see, that I know will not result in anything. It's not going to solve the problem for either side, right? I guess at 49, I feel old enough to say this. Like I still have hope, but that's obviously not a solution. I think that when we really get down to the neuroscience of self-understanding, when people really start to understand that the human brain is a magnificent machine and organ, but that it has limitations, and we can start to understand our own limitations, you know, that it can take us just up to this point, but not further, and that we can rely on healthy collective thinking to get us over these divides. I think that's when we're finally going to evolve as a species. I really do. When we start being able to exit our own brain and our groupthink to be able to really come to solutions, because often we just think in terms of compromise and conflict, which are essential things to think about, but ultimately understanding the limits of our cognition and how emotion drives cognition is really how we're going to be able to evolve our beliefs about what's possible. And by the way, that's not meant to just be a bunch of aspirational word salad. That's like a real possibility if we can just have the self-reflection to understand we know certain things, we believe certain things, but that this neural architecture that we call our brain is limited in the extent to which it can see into the future and make the best decisions for everybody. We operate thinking that, but that's not how it works. And of course, we can't look to any one individual to solve the problem for everybody. Now, will it be AI? I don't know. That involves a lot of trust in AI. And these large language models are trained in many ways the same way that a neural network, it trains itself up, how a young brain develops and makes sense of the world. So I don't have any immediate solutions. What I do have is a piece of neuroscience knowledge that was at least new to me that most neuroscientists aren't aware of, but I think this is one of the most important discoveries in the last 100 years of neuroscience. It's a collection of studies on an area of the brain called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. Most people have never heard of this brain area, including many neuroscientists. Talk to a neurosurgeon, they know where it is. You talk to a neuroscientist, unless they teach neuroanatomy, which I happen to, most don't know where it is in the brain. And most didn't know what it did because it hadn't been explored. And then a colleague of mine at Stanford School of Medicine named Joe Parvizi did an incredible study where he was doing neurosurgery and stimulating different brain areas as a means to try and find the location where he needed to do the surgery. And he stumbled upon an area called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex where if he stimulated with an electrode, people, because they were awake during the neurosurgery, would report feeling as if there was some conflict pressing on them. One even described it as, I feel like I'm driving into a storm, but I feel ready. I can do this. Others reported a different set of words, but the words essentially converged around the same set of subjective experiences, which are, I feel challenged, but I can do it. This kind of forward center of mass. And then other studies, separate laboratories, discovered that people that take on a new practice that's challenging for them, their anterior mid-cingulate cortex grows in volume. Other people who fail to successfully engage in a regular challenging activity, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex didn't increase in volume in the same way. So very interesting brain structure. And there's, I would say, about a dozen or so really quality studies in humans, a bunch in animal models, but there are a bunch in humans that point to the anterior mid-cingulate cortex as a site in the brain associated with the feeling of tenacity and willpower to push through. It's heavily interconnected with the dopamine reward system, heavily connected, frankly, with a lot of different brain areas. It's a hub for a lot of inputs and outputs. So what do we know about the anterior mid-cingulate cortex? Perhaps most interesting of all is that this is the brain area that seems to preserve its size and even grow in size in what are called superagers. Superagers are people that maintain their cognition later into life. These are people that don't undergo the normal age-related decline in cognition, separate from Alzheimer's type dementia. You know, everybody as they get older develops less working memory, the ability to keep ideas in mind in the short term. Superagers seem to overcome all that. And they live longer. So you could say, well, this is a case of reverse causality. They live longer, so they have a bigger brain area called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. We don't really know what the direction of causality is. It could just be correlation. But it all gets ultra interesting when you start to tack together willpower, the taking on of new things, learning things in neuroplasticity and lifespan. And it may be that that quadfecta represents what we think of as the will to live is associated with an intense curiosity and desire to bring in new ideas and modes of thinking. And new ideas and modes of thinking then feed back on our feelings of how we could gain reward, internal reward, of course, dopamine being the universal currency of reward, as a means to move forward. What does this mean? This means that everybody, I believe, can become a better human being by taking on challenges. What is a challenge that can grow the anterior mid-cingulate cortex? Well, unfortunately, it's a challenge that you don't want to engage in. So if you love running, it's not going to do it. Yeah. If you love resistance training, it's not going to do it. If you don't want to meditate in the morning and you do 5 minutes or 10 minutes of meditation, then you just enhance the activation of your anterior mid-cingulate cortex. So it's not just about doing hard things, it's about really pushing through resistance. And the reason I bring this up now, as opposed to in a discussion about like how to get more tenacious or have stronger willpower, it will do that. Okay, we know that when the anterior mid-cingulate cortex gets bigger, it translates to a lot of different areas of challenge, not just the area in which you challenged it. The reason is, I believe that this lofty notion of humans evolving to more collective thinking, to embracing new ways to bridge divides that harm human beings at scale or even just locally, is going to emerge only through the willingness to embrace the internal friction that is hearing things and seeing things that we don't like and being able to take a stance of adaptive response, whatever that is. Now, of course, there are things that we hear and see and don't like that activate enough of a sense of injustice in us that that's all it does. It just brings us to the point of like wanting to impart justice. But what I'm talking about here are differences in opinion, strongly polarized views that lead to all sorts of things, as we know, good and bad and everything in between. And if people had the capacity to feel that friction and to stay in a mode of some open cognition, I think we would come up with novel solutions. I really think the next iteration of human beings is collective consciousness. It sounds lofty, sounds woo, but it's basically lots of minds working together, even minds that oppose one another in ideology, as a means to find out novel solutions to hard problems that vex us all, and that in some cases really harm us all. It's a real thing with real possibility, but it's going to require that we all get not necessarily tougher, but that we get more resilient at the level of being able to tolerate internal states that normally would impede adaptive thinking.
Yes. And the ability to engage in uncomfortable thinking. And I love that definition that you gave. I saw this brilliant quote the other day on social media, and it was from a Christian page or a post, and it said the essence of Christianity is not learning to love Jesus, but learning to love Judas. And I was thinking how brilliant that was, because it goes back to that point of what's uncomfortable. Like it's easy to love the good person. It's learning to love or understand